I bought the place because I wanted to disappear. Not in the melodramatic way people say that in movies, the grand exit with a suitcase and a plane ticket, but quietly, deliberately. Diana had been gone 3 years by then, and the small apartment in Seattle where we'd kept our lives carefully stacked felt more like a gallery of absence than a home. I wanted wood that creaked under real weight, wind that came without a city's roar behind it, the kind of silence that lets a person remember himself. When my real estate agent, Daniel, sent me the listing for a house tucked into the western slope of the Cascades, I clicked without much hope, and then, oddly, with a kind of relief. 70 years of storms had given it a shape I liked. Low eaves, stone chimney, deep porches that disappeared into shadow. The guardian trees made the place look as if it had been forgotten on purpose. George Carlson had built it as a retreat in the 70s, my title paperwork said. Dorothy, his daughter, handled the sale. She spoke on the phone with a voice that held a town's worth of memory and an old woman's practical thrift. "It's not exactly vacant," she'd said once, the pause in her voice saying more than the words. "There are signs. George liked visitors, even if they weren't exactly people." I smiled at that and thought of hoarding my solitude with a book and a pot of coffee. Daniel assured me the neighbors were friendly enough, and the drive-in from the highway was manageable. I closed the deal. The first months were everything I expected and more. The property settled around me like a slow breath. Mornings smelled of damp cedar and thawing earth. Afternoons threw thin golden light through the pines and onto a house that seemed to have been built around the angles of the sun. I spent my days fixing small things, a porch rail that leaned, a gutter that had given up, replacing sash cords that had frayed down to whispers. At night I would sit by the fire and read things I'd never read when Diana was alive, because I had never had the discipline. Thoreau, odd collections of essays about wilderness. I would think about the software companies I'd helped build, and leave behind the rush and the calls and the quiet emails that used to come at all hours. There was a steady comfort in the physical labor of keeping a house alive. Then, the house reminded me that I wasn't the only creature who liked an old shelter. The first oddity was small and laughable when I tell it now. A loaf of bread moved from the counter to the windowsill. I had baked it against a rainstorm and left it to cool. The next morning, it sat like a careful offering, a scattering of crumbs fanned into a purposeful arc. The house has mice, of course, and birds like to hover near the kitchen light at night. But the crumbs were arranged, not scattered. Someone, something, had taken the loaf with a kind of civility. A week later, I found pine cones set in a line on the outside steps, each one carefully peeled of the loose scales in a pattern that made no practical sense. Inside the attic, which I'd been avoiding because attics are where old dramas hang in dust, there were handprints in the insulation. Large prints, 3 across my palm, pressed enough that the dust lay in clear negative spaces. They were placed as though someone had been looking out the window for a long time. I would tell myself there was a reason for each piece, that people leave gifts and artists leave strange arrangements, and the forest positions things oddly when it wants to be beautiful. But some mornings my boots would be set out in a different orientation. A small carved wooden bear, naive, charming, someone's amateur craft, wound up on the mantel one damp afternoon when I had been gone for an hour. The bear had been sanded and burnished by hand. Someone had spent time on it. The smell that came with it was not the common musk of a wild animal, but something closer to wood smoke and the sweetness of dried bark. It tugged at a memory in me the way Diana's scarves used to. A neighborless house can encourage eccentricity. I tried to treat these things like eccentricities. I labeled them curiosities. Some days I would laugh aloud, holding the carved bear and imagining some kindly hiker with an artisanal hobby. Some nights, after too much coffee and thinner courage, I would lie awake and imagine otherwise. I began to imagine otherwise the day I found the basement. The house had a basement door that opened into a cold stone room designed for root vegetables and the kind of preservation that had gone out of fashion. A furnace rumbled like a distant animal. I'd been meaning to organize the boxes down there. It was a place of flattened cardboard and my boxes of old documents and cassette tapes I had never digitized. I opened the door one afternoon and the smell hit me. That layered scent of stale air overlaid with something clean, something like pine tar and a faint hint of iron. The light from my flashlight cut across a neat row of things I had not put there. A handful of canned goods lined the shelf, but they weren't the kind of hoarded cans a burglar would buy in bulk. These were small jars, the labels handwritten, preserved cherries, a pot of broth that looked like someone intended to use it with care. A folded blanket lay across a small raised platform that served like a bed. There were tools arranged on the wall with a steadiness that belonged to a hand that wanted order. On a little workbench sat a collection of wooden carvings, small animals, spoons, a roughly shaped model of the house itself. The carvings were weathered and scuffed in places, each with a tiny gouge as if made by a similar thumb. Someone had been living down there, not in the shadow of crime, but with a slow and deliberate domesticity that took effort and patience. A carved stool sat near the hearth. The stool was small but competent. There were smudges on the stone hearth where soot had been rubbed away, as if someone had tended the coals recently, and a faint ring on the floor where a kettle might have been. Most oddly of all, a chalkboard leaned against the wall. It was small, the sort you'd find in a general store, edged with little chips. There were a few marks in a hand that was not mine, jagged chalk lines like a child's drawing, and, beneath them, a crude map of the grounds with a few paths marked in. I remember thinking that the presence of a map in a basement meant someone had been thinking about where to go and where to stay. I did what I should have done then and what I had sworn never to do in the soft logic of my city life. I told no one. Not Daniel, not Dorothy. The basement felt private, like a secret museum left for me to discover alone. My mind built scenarios, squatters wanting a cheap place to sleep, artists, a recluse. When the world narrows to a single breath, people can become anything convenient. The first real proof came later, not with bone or blood, but with flesh and movement filmed in the amber gloom of my camcorder. I am a man who worked with cameras in the sense that any software executive reads screens. I am not a hunter, not a wildlife filmmaker. I had an old camcorder, the kind that captures grain and honest light. I set it up with the technical negligence of someone who had to teach himself patience and then point at whatever came into the frame. The camera faced the hearth where the carvings had been found, running on a cycle at night, because if there is one thing the city gave me, it was an appreciation for the way time reveals truth. The footage is not cinematic. It is a study in small things. A ripple of breath fogging the air, the slow unwrapping of a loaf of bread, a hand entering the frame. The hand is the first thing I noticed, because hands mean intent. It is too large to be an ordinary human hand, long knuckles, nails like weathered horn. It takes a spoon and places it deliberately. The figure steps into the light in one stuttering block, a shoulder taller than a doorway, an arm that brushes the mantel and comes away with flakes of soot, a head bowed by a mane of coarse hair. For a moment, I thought of the giant sculptures that exist in roadside curiosity museums, an assemblage of wood and burlap. This was not that. For all the size and the hair, the figure moved with a gentleness that suggested it understood fragility. There is no roar. There is a low, resonant sound, a hum or a croon that comes from the figure's throat. It is not a language I recognize. It might be song, it might be a way of testifying to the night. The camera sees shoulders and ribs, and the slow way flesh returns to itself after a breath. The figure tends a small fire, adds a stick with an economy of motion, sits on the small stool with the posture of someone who has spent years doing that same simple act, and then, with surprising care, lays a carved spoon beside a loaf of bread. The camera, affectionate and honest, caught what a city camera would never bother to capture: a hand smoothing a carving, the shadow of the creature's eye caught for a second on the bevel of the hearthstone. When I watched the footage the next morning, I did not watch it as a man discovering a myth. I watched it as a man who had been made into a father by grief, a man who was trying to be quiet because his own noise had been a kind of violence. I watched the creature, because what else was there to call it, move like a neighbor, and felt something in my chest break and rearrange itself into curiosity and care. I rewound the tape 5, 10 times, as if repeated viewing would make the image less disturbing or more plausible. The figure was bipedal. Its gait was deliberate. It kept its head slightly turned toward the camera, as if it sensed the lens and made a decision about whether to trust it. It did not flee. I named him that night because names are how we make a thing less monstrous. Kren came out of nowhere, a syllable that felt honest in my mouth. I do not know what Kren means in any language. I only know how it felt when the sound of it sat in the quiet of my kitchen. It was a silly, human way of doing what humans do. We name what we fear, so that we can schedule it. We do not have to live under the tyranny of the unknown. Saying the name out loud made me feel less like a trespasser. There was a gentleness to his presence that complicated everything I had read about myths and monsters. He did not ransack my cupboards, he did not wear my shirts or sleep in my bed. He lived in the margins, the basement made warm by a small, careful fire, carvings arranged like a private museum, and the smell of wood smoke that never felt like a threat. When I left a slice of bread on the step, I would return to find it gone and a carved bead in its place. When I left small repairs undone, I sometimes returned to discover a tool left in the right place, its handle smoothed by a hand that knew how to tend wood. There were times his intelligence showed in ways that were almost human, and times when it felt alien. He learned quickly to rearrange my boots the way someone else had taught him. He cleaned the hearth with ritualistic attention. Once, when a letter arrived and I left it unopened by the kettle, I found the flap carefully pressed, as if someone had known there was a secret inside. He would not touch the photographs of Diana. He would stand in the doorway of that room and then walk away, always as if respect was its own religion. The first week I thought of running. I thought of calling someone with more authority than I had, a wildlife official, a professor, a conservation group. But something inside me balked. This was not a human I could enroll in a department or a case study. This was someone else's life folding into mine. He had made a small room beneath my house, like a person would build a grove for nesting. He had been here, I learned, for decades. His carvings were old and many. Some pieces had the kind of polish that comes from being handled lovingly for years. His presence was less a squatting thief than a long-term inhabitant who had chosen the shelter as he might choose an island when the sea rearranges itself. We began a slow choreography. My first move was to stop leaving the basement door open at night. I would leave a loaf of bread at the base of the stair and step away, seeing whether the bread moved in small intervals. I learned that he preferred dense bread, the kind with seed and crust. He arranged slices in a fan. He would leave pressed leaves where he wanted me to stand, and then gently take them away when I did not oblige. In return, he left little repairs on the porch. A loose step tightened, a sagging beam supported with a brace I had not thought to use. His gifts were practical and modest. A spoon, a polishing cloth, a carved tile with a bear that had one ear turned slightly toward the house. Once he left a necklace of small polished stones threaded on a piece of sinew. It smelled like the river that feeds the property and made me think of some small ritual I had not yet learned the rules of. We moved for a time like two people learning a dance where the rules were half remembered. He would leave the chalk marks on the little board in the basement, and I would answer with a scrawled date and a word. He did not write like a person taught in school. His marks were pictorial, a sequence of lines and circles that meant more than the letters they coalesced into. I would add something, a loop, a line, and walk away, leaving a small offering. The first time he responded with a carving that plainly referenced my arrival, a little house etched into a square of wood with a tiny person next to it, I sat on the step for a long time and felt like a child watching rain. There were tender, almost comic moments. Once, determined to communicate on higher ground, I bought a small packet of chalk reminiscent of children's games and left little colored marks on a tree stump near the back porch. The next morning, the chalk was rearranged into a spiral that spoke a language I could not parse, but instinctively felt as an invitation. He had a sense of humor. He liked to stack pine cones in columns and then knock them down with the softness of a deer starting in the snow. He tended the garden of his living room like a man who had time and patience to care for the tiny ecosystems within a house. I told myself often that what I had found was not a creature to be proved, but a life to be respected. But outside the house, human life has a way of pressing forward, like the tide. Word travels in directions a man on a mountain cannot always predict. A hiker found a trail and took a photograph of a footprint near the river, one that was longer, wider, and deeper than the cleat of an ordinary boot. The photo landed on a forum late at night and ignited the sort of curiosity that is a bandwidth-consuming beast. Someone else posted it, and then another, and before I had time to decide what it meant to be secret, I found myself reading speculative threads and private messages asking me, indirectly and clumsily, if I had heard any stories about strange things in the mountains. Daniel, who had sold me the house, made an offhand remark in a phone call about the rumor of footsteps and then apologized, embarrassed that the small town's gossip might fetch a curiosity hunter. He meant well. He did not mean to be the match. The first sign of external threat was not dramatic. It was a boot print that crossed onto my property and stopped. It was a camera on a tree, not my camera, trained on a path that skirted the boundary. Someone had made an effort to stay hidden. When I traced the camera's trail the next afternoon, trying to be practical and not alarmed, I found a bit of nylon red ribbon tied to a branch. The kind of ribbon people use to mark trails for research studies or to identify trees for harvest. I cut it down and kept it in my pocket like a small accusation. That night, I watched the camcorder footage with a new kind of attention. Cran moved as he always did, but there was an alertness in his posture I had not seen before. He widened his stance when he heard something at the edge of the frame. He listened to the air like a man who had spent his life on the fringe of a louder world. The thing about being the only person who knows is that you must become a judge of risk alone. I weighed exposure against secrecy like coins in a palm. If the creature were to be discovered by people without care, hunters, cryptozoologists driven by fame, and by fame-driven men they would hire, the consequences would not be about proof alone. They would be about the invasive toll of flashbulbs and the coarse fascination of strangers. The forest that had known him for decades would become a stage. I remember the evening he left his first unambiguous message for me. It was not the carved spoon or the cleaned hearth. It was a picture on the chalkboard that I found one slow morning when the sun was low and the house seemed to be breathing out after a long night. He had laid his handprints around the board as if to say, "This is mine," and then drawn a sequence of images in crude, heartbreaking precision. The first was a line of trees, simple triangles with trunks. Then a saw, drawn with a serrated blade. Then a falling tree, rendered in swift diagonal strokes, wood splintering. Beside that, a column of smoke. Beyond the smoke, a crude human figure with a rectangular object in front of its face, a camera. The final image was a small figure of a creature like him, running, smaller with each line that followed it, until the last figure was nothing but an empty circle. I did not sit down when I saw the board. I felt a pressure climb in my chest like the unwinding of a clock spring. It was not supernatural, it was insider testimony, an eyewitness sketch from a life that had seen trees taken and habitats rearranged. The message was not a prophecy, it was an accounting. It was the sum of decades of slow encroachment drawn with chalk. I listened for the sound of him then, wanting to hear whether there was anger in the low notes he had used before, or something like grief. He came to the basement not with violence, but with the same deliberate care he had shown for everything else. He set a small packet on the workbench.
a handful of stones, polished smooth and threaded on a strip of bark. He placed them with the same tenderness he used to set the spoon. When his hand brushed mine, I cannot call it contact between species, that would be knotted with presumption. He looked at me as if asking what I would do. The look was not an appeal to heroics, it was a simple question about whether a neighbor would remain a neighbor. I had to decide then, in a way that felt both trivial and consequential, whether to tell the world or to hide the fact under the earth like a secret of the old religion. I thought of Diana and how often she had urged me to be careful with the things that could not tell their own story. I thought of the carved bear on the mantel and the way its one ear had been set to listen instead of to warn. I thought of the boot print at the boundary and the nylon ribbon that had been tied to a branch. If I stayed true to the impulse that put me on that mountain, if I sought to preserve the solitude I had bought, I would keep silent and do everything in my power to protect him, to build a shield of privacy around his home. If I told someone, there existed the chance, however small and however ethical, that this life might be studied and protected inside a framework that could, legally and practically, prevent harm. But the legal world is clumsy, and people who write papers often have a way of forgetting the things they study are lives. I ended the night by leaving a small pile of cloths and a pot of broth by the stair. I left a note that said in my clumsy human hand, "I will not tell." It was not a vow, it was the beginning of an arrangement. He circled the note with his forefinger, the chalk smudging slender arcs of understanding. His fingers trembled as he traced the letters, and for a moment I thought, absurdly, humanly, that he was learning to read us like we learned the tracks of deer in winter. That winter, the neighborhood's curiosity deepened into something like a pressure wave.
A hiker posted a longer sequence of footprints near the ridge, and a couple of amateur researchers pinged Daniel with polite questions about histories of sightings. Someone I did not know messaged me a cropped photo and the question, "Have you heard anything?" I deleted it. I wanted to be careful in a way that was not showy. I wanted to be incorruptible in my secrecy. There were other signs too. A truck with a logo I could not place idled one afternoon on the road below the property. Lights on in the cab, though it was hours before dawn. I watched it from the porch with a kind of patient, mourning attention. The truck's position suggested not casual passage, but investigation. I interviewed myself like a judge and kept returning to the same honest truth. If Cran is as old as the carvings suggest, he has lessons that outlast the men who cut the trees. The danger to him is not a single hunter or a headline. It is the slow arithmetic of appetite, people's tendency to take until nothing is left. I began, in secret, to learn how to defend without exposing. I learned the names of legal instruments that could, in theory, protect land without surrendering its location to the public. I read about conservation easements, trusts, and sealed records. The language felt like antiseptic bandages for a wound I did not want to open. I took notes. There would be a time for that knowledge. I could feel its contour on the horizon. For now, the dance of trust and silence had to continue. There were nights when Cran would sit outside the basement, looking at the house as if cataloging every joint of it, every notch and nick. He would sometimes draw in the dirt with a stick, the outline of a tree, the arc of the river, the hump of the hills. He taught me a few rhythms, the way his breath came in cold weather, the way his hands found the knots in wood like they were old friends. Once, in an intimacy neither of us had planned, he took my hand with both of his and then lifted it to his face as if learning the shape of a human. He smelled of pine and wet fur and something like the inside of a well. When he looked up, his eyes were luminous in a way that had nothing of the monster tales I'd grown up with. They were full of a false sun patience, the look of someone who had watched much and needed little. The camcorder footage grew bolder, as if, between us, permission had been negotiated. He would appear in snatches, the curve of a shoulder, the slow stroke of a carving knife, his mouth making a soft syllable. He did not speak a word I could repeat.
His communication was in tools and tokens and the kinds of drawings that translate grief into images. But the world outside proved persistent. Footprints became a post on a forum. Voices became emails. Men came up the road ostensibly to hunt elk and then lingered, their conversation ringing thinly through the trees.
I started to see glints of binoculars in sunbreaks and a silhouette of a man with a camera at the tree line, the way a coyote might watch from the brush. They were not openly threatening, but curiosity is a zero-sum game. For every witness, there is a risk. On a crystal course of night, I sat on the porch and watched the stars. Kren stood with me, a shadow among shadows, and pointed toward the eastern ridge where, in the distance, city lights lay like a second sky. He then drew a small, ragged figure of a tree and, with the edge of his finger, carved a line through it, as if illustrating an incision. He held up his hand and blew on it in a way I had never seen him do before. Then he made a low sound that was not a complaint, but an account. I understood the sense of it like a translation you have to do in your bones. He had seen the line carved into the earth before. I had begun to believe our arrangement could continue indefinitely, a quiet pact that the city would not come. I had begun to suppose the mountain would be patient. Then, one afternoon in the thinning light, I found an imprint at the edge of my property I could not explain away. It was a deep, wide track pressed into the mud like a hand that wanted to be seen. Around it were other marks suggesting machines had been there not long before. Men do not always announce their arrival. Sometimes they come like the weather, and the damage is there when you get up. I walked back to the house with the imprint in my mind, like the image of a slow-pressing palm. Kren watched me as if he had catalogued the same impression, and then added another layer to my understanding with the clearest gesture he had made since I'd known him. He drew on the chalkboard a series of images that mapped a story. The first was of trees, standing, then a blunt line of a saw, then a falling trunk, and then a column of smoke. He drew a small human with a camera and a man with an axe. He drew a small creature running. The sequence was simple and brutal. When I looked at it, I felt the world tilt in that private way grief sometimes does, as if something you love had slid a little further away. The chalk effort was not a howl, but a statement, like a diary entry carved with urgency. I could no longer pretend I had time to be only reactionary. A decision had to be made, and it would not be an easy one, because the right actions often sit between two kinds of wrong. Keep silent and hope the mountain continues to keep its secret. Tell the world and risk turning Kren's life into a spectacle, a case study, a news clip that would end with a hashtag. The chalkboard did not offer options. It had simply drawn the consequence. That night, I loaded the camcorder footage onto my old laptop and watched the small, grainy images until my eyes throbbed. There, in the wash of pixels, the creature moved with a slow, deliberate authority into the light. He tended his fire as if it were a litany, and then, for the first time I recall, he looked straight at the camera and seemed to understand its gaze with a sadness that was older than any single human life I have known. He was weary, not wild. He was not a monster. He was a witness. I sat on the floor with the laptop on my knees and felt the weight of the choice as a physical thing. I had thought I wanted to disappear. Now I understood that sometimes disappearance is not about escaping the world, but about protecting what is not yet known. Diana used to say that the things worth saving are often the ones that speak in soft and stubborn voices. I had a guest in my basement whose voice was a sequence of nails and warmth and carved wood. He had left a message that read like a ledger of harm. He had asked me, in the only way he could, to answer. Outside, someone moved at the edge of the property. A footstep or a piece of the underbrush settling, the sound was small but savage in the quiet. The creek ran on, indifferent. I left the laptop on the coffee table and went to the basement where the chalkboard waited like a mandate. Kren's half-moons of chalk still gleamed with his work.
Near it, neatly arranged as always, were a handful of small polished stones. I picked one up and felt the weight of it as though it contained all the histories that had led me here. I had not yet done anything to secure him legally. I had not told Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a conservationist I admired, or sought counsel. I had only the footage, the carvings, the chalked sequence of trees and smoke, and the small knowledge that the world presses in when something is true. I set the stone back and, with my hands that still carry the memory of corporate negotiation in spreadsheets, made a plan that was as human as it was inadequate. I would not call in a camera crew. I would not open the house to the curious. I would keep a record of the evidence stored in a place that was not public. I would try, with the clumsy courage of men who keep libraries in sheds, to find legal shelter for the land itself. I would not promise success. I would promise only one thing. I would not betray his trust for the sake of a story. When I closed the basement door behind me that night, I felt the house settle into a guarded silence, as if it too had elected to keep a secret. Kren's message had been frightening, not because it conjured apocalypse, but because it was an honest accounting of what we do. We take and take until there is nothing left to take. I thought of the carved bear on the mantel, and how its ear was turned toward the room, listening. I left a final small offering on the steps before I went to bed, a strip of fabric, clean and scented with laundry soap, and on it a note in my neat hand. I will not tell unless it will help you. I do not know if he could read my handwriting, but the next morning the fabric was gone and a new carving lay on the workbench. A tree with a thin line beneath it that could be a river or a scar. It was not an answer, it was an invitation. The next days would demand paperwork and secrecy and the kind of legal language that reads like anesthesia. There would be a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell eventually, with a slow, practical voice and not a single headline in her eyes. There would be legal forms and sealed trusts, and more wood shavings than I thought possible for a house to produce. There would be men with cameras and the clumsy danger of curiosity, and there would be a choice I had to make not as a hermit, but as a guardian. But none of that was yet. For now, the mountain held its breath with us. For now, I sat on the porch at dusk, and Kren came to the steps, and we watched the light break on the pines like scoring on a board. He would reach out occasionally, not to hold my hand permanently, but to touch the sleeve of my jacket as if confirming that I was still there. There was a small, stubborn comfort in that gesture. If you like true feeling mysteries with a slow burn rather than a scream, stay with me. There is more to this house than the first discoveries, and the real question is not whether I can prove what I saw, but whether I have the courage to protect it. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived the way good people arrive when they mean business, but not spectacle. Not with lights and a camera crew, but in a small rental van with plain plates and a box of thermoses. She was younger than I had pictured, all elbows and steady eyes, hair pulled back in a way that made her face look as if it had been carved by practice and patience rather than vanity. She had read my email twice on the drive over, she told me, because the way I'd written it made her think I was either a novelist or someone who might need protection. She studied the footage on my laptop without comment, fingers drumming the table while she watched the grain of the camcorder reveal a life that did not appear in field guides. "You understand," she said finally, "that I can't sign anything that makes this public. And you understand that my first duty is to the life in that basement, not to headlines." Her voice was careful. The sentence felt like a boundary marker I had asked for but still needed to hear. "I do," I said. It felt smaller than the promise I had made to the chalkboard, but it was a promise all the same. The words broke somewhere under my larynx. She did not ask what had happened to Diana. She did not need to. We walked the property together in a kind of ritual that felt more like negotiation than inspection. She moved through the house as if it contained not only boards and beams, but lives with histories to be read. She crouched by the hearth, traced the soot as if reading a paragraph, and then followed the stare down with a steady calm. She did not flinch at the carved spoon or the little tree model. She treated each object as evidence and evidence as responsibility. Her team arrived in dribs and drabs over the next week. There was a field biologist named Aaron who had the sort of slow, observational attention you get only from years of living outside a lab. He noticed the way the hair caught in a crack of the sill, the pattern of lichen worn on the stones, the nesting of twigs around a hearth. There was a conservation lawyer, Mara, whose first question was always, predictably, about ownership and rights. She had the voice that could make dense legalese into a shield rather than a trap. There was a woman from a regional land trust who preferred to speak in technical phrases like easement and stewardship plan. But when she saw the model of the house on my workbench, she let her expression soften until it was almost private. They did not want to see Kren. They wanted evidence enough to justify protecting a parcel of land without turning it into a spectacle. That would be a strange task, to use the blunt instruments of law to protect someone precisely by making sure the law would not air his existence. But it is the paradox of guardianship. Sometimes you need the state's mechanisms to secure silence. We spoke in long rooms and short sentences. Mara drew diagrams in the margin of my notebook and shaded in places where confidentiality could be built into ownership. A conservation easement held by a trusted organization, legal trust documents that restricted disclosure, sealed scientific records that could be reviewed only under court order or within narrow, agreed parameters. She did not give me instructions on how to hide a creature, nor would she. She explained frameworks, not how-tos. That, too, felt like part of the careful, adult work of protecting a life. Aaron collected samples in ways that respected the privacy of what he was studying. He did not trample the brush or cut saplings for trophies. He took what needed to be taken and left the rest. Some hair clinging to a carved spoon's handle, a faint whorl of scent in a folded blanket he placed in a sterile bag and then sealed. He photographed, measured, and labeled with temperate, professional calm. He refused any public release of the material without strict oversight. "We're documenting a pattern of occupation," he said, "not building a press release." We sat once in the kitchen, late, with the kettle sweating and the house settling into its usual nighttime grammar. Aaron had spread slides across the table. They looked modest and forbidding, like footprints in a language that still needed translating. Dr. Mitchell watched them and folded her hands as if the evidence were words in a book. "He has been here a long time," she said, "long enough to develop cultural artifacts, long enough to have a home." She used the word home the way one uses a fact. I remember thinking then that the moral calculus was simpler on paper than it was under the skin. People are good at abstract protections, trusts, easements, sealed records, until they have to sign the paper that could cost them exposure or social reward. Compassion without bureaucracy is an act of will. Compassion with bureaucracy is a process. We needed both. Our plan developed slowly because haste is a poor friend to secrecy. Mara arranged for a conservation easement to be drafted in the name of the land trust. The trust would hold the legal obligation to protect the property's ecological values, while an anonymous donor or a small private grant would provide funds for ongoing stewardship. We agreed that certain files, the camcorder footage, Aaron's field notes, my journal, would be stored under court-sealed conditions at a regional archive with an access protocol. The archive would hold the evidence but not publish it. Access would be granted only in extraordinary circumstances and only under strict confidentiality agreements. There would be a small circle of people who knew the truth. That smallness felt like oxygen. Kren watched these meetings in the way of someone who had learned to read tone and face. He did not attend the kitchen table at the same time as we did. He preferred the margin of things, appearing when the light pooled in the doorway. He would kneel on the bottom stair while we argued technicalities, and then draw a line on the chalkboard afterwards that asked no questions. A saw crossed out, a tree with many rings, a human figure with a hat pulled low over the eyes. We showed him the legal people, not papers, and he would circle the board as if hearing a story, and then carve one of our pens into a small boat. The first real test of our plan came sooner than I'd hoped. It was a Sunday, bright and keen. I had promised myself a long, useless walk to clear the anxious ash in my chest. The trees were brittle with late-season frost, and the ridge to the north cut a silhouette like an old knife. I walked the less-trod path that skirts the creek, collecting my thoughts and watching the way the forest accumulated light. When I returned, the porch steps creaked in a way that felt like an altered chord. There was a new footprint in the dust by the side door, fresh, heavy, not mine. Something had come onto the property while we were drafting clauses and sealing envelopes. I felt a quick, hot panic that is different from fear. It is the sound of a boundary you have only just learned to hold. I went into the house on purpose now, thinking I might find a camera, a hidden lens. The house felt measuredly empty. The basement door was closed. The chalkboard was clean. And then I heard the voices at the edge of the property line, low, curious, the kind that picks its words like tentative pokes. They were not organized men in uniform. They were three, two with cameras slung, and one with the kind of cheap but earnest binoculars you buy at sporting goods stores and convince yourself will change your life. Their jackets had logos for a wildlife blog and a pale online forum. Their shoes were caked in mud. They spoke in the thin, buzzy language of the internet obsessed. One of them used the phrase legend, and the others laughed too loud. I wanted in that moment to do two things that were mutually exclusive: to protect and to explain. I went to the porch with my voice steady despite the color in my throat. "Can I help you?" I called. The nearest man jumped, camera lifting like a reflex. The reply was cautious, a practiced gentleness meant to disarm. "Hey, sorry to bother. We're just heard about footprints up the ridge. Thought we'd, well, see." I made a decision that surprised me in its calm. I told them unequivocally that this was private property, that they had no permission to be here, and that I would call the sheriff if they did not leave. There are better ways to manage curiosity than force. For a private landowner, the clear voice and a threat of legal action are often enough. They balked for a heartbeat and then grumbled away, cameras slung like tired laurels. They did not leave far enough. That night, one of their cameras appeared on a tree closer to the eastern boundary. It was an ordinary thing to an ordinary eye, a small box with a barrel, but to me it read like an incision. Dr. Mitchell and Aaron came over before dawn. We did not trespass into the area where the camera was. We photographed it from a respectful distance and then logged its position for the record. Mara advised we refrain from disassembling it. Legal tangles arise when people start scavenging other people's equipment, even if those people are being careless. We documented and called the owner of the camera through channels, leaving a message that this property was under legal protection and requesting the device be removed. The camera stayed for 2 days. Each sunset made Kren more alert. His hand movements in the basement became smaller, his chalk lines angrier. One evening he drew a sequence that stopped us cold. A row of cameras, flashbulbs bobbing like teeth. A human figure with hands raised to a face. Then a tree with a hatchet. The drawing was simple and precise, like a tally of possibilities. I remember thinking then that danger arrives in houses and also in devices. The men with cameras grew bolder. Once, in broad daylight, they stood at the far edge of my property and chatted into their mics about getting a shot and noting behavior. They were not sinister actors in hunting gear. Their greed was softer, the kind that comes with the hunger for followers. But hunger, whatever its shape, makes people forget they are dealing with lives. It makes cameras into weapons. Mara wrote a letter, in language that stopped being poetry and became armor. She sent a carefully worded cease and desist to the domain that hosted their forum, citing harassment and trespass. She notified local enforcement that the property was under a pending easement and that unauthorized surveillance was being recorded for possible legal action. The letter had no fanfare, but it worked. The camera that had been on the tree was removed. The forum thread cooled like a fire with the oxygen cut off. Still, there was a cost. The incident had shown me my own failure to imagine the ingenuity of people searching for a story. It had shown Kren the edges of human curiosity made visible as metallic lenses. He responded with a new drawing that night, not of trees felled nor of cameras, but of himself. A small figure with hands outstretched to a ring of trees.
Around him, the ring was broken. He had drawn not just a map of threats, but a plea for the woodland itself. That drawing finally pushed us into action with the legal paperwork. The easement was drafted in a way that kept the property's location confidential in public filings, using the land trust as a cover of legitimate stewardship. An agreement was reached to hold certain scientific materials under seal with the regional archive. The land trust agreed to take the property into a stewardship plan contingent on the trust receiving an anonymous donation to fund ongoing protections. Mara found a donor who preferred to remain unnamed and arranged the trust so my title could be transferred into a stewardship trust rather than sold into oblivion. Each doc was checked and counterchecked. Signatures were gathered not flamboyantly, but with the weary civility of people arranging a long-term burial. The legal work was not a guarantee. It was a set of obstacles designed to slow the rush of curiosity down until it exhausted itself. We signed papers in offices smelling of sterilized ink, and I felt at odd moments like I was enacting some small magic, turning the blunt mechanisms of law into a curtain. Mara called it protective anonymity. Aaron called it ethical mediation. I called it a hope. There was still the night the hunters came. They were not the camera boys. These were different men. One old enough that a decade or two of hunting had left a kind of practiced gravity in his shoulders. The other younger and restless, laughing too loudly at his own bravado. They pushed up the drive with a truck that did not belong in the county. It had a winch and mudlaps on the fender. We heard them before we saw them, the engine a low predator's sound in the quiet. I was on the porch when they stepped out of the trees, and for a moment the house held its breath. Cran was not at my side that night. Whether out of luck or because he was choosing to stay away from a potential confrontation, I do not know. I felt acutely, absurdly unhinged. Here I was, the guardian by default, a man whose life had been a string of contracts, required to act as a wall between a myth and men.
"Nice place," the older man said, voice thick with the kind of ownership people attempt when something is tempting. "You seeing things around here? Footprints?" His companion moved like a camera gimbal rotates, looking for a shot. They were aiming toward the boundary, toward where they had calved out a bit of hope the week before. I told them, calmly but warm as glass, that the land was private. They walked closer, as if the law was a fog that could be brushed aside. I called the sheriff. My voice did not tremble. The sheriff arrived with the slow authority of a man used to being the last arbiter of small-town storms. He asked for my identification, and I told him, and he watched me like a judge. The hunters argued, their voices getting loud as desperation touches pride. The sheriff listened, then did a deliberate thing that felt like a rehearsal I hadn't known I needed. He told them to leave, that if they crossed the boundary, the law would be on them, and he wrote down my statement. The men left, cursing softly, their truck accelerating into the road like a beast chastised. When they had gone, I sat on the porch until the stars sanded the sky. Kren pressed his palm against the doorframe as if to confirm the house still had a human in residence. He did not say anything. His eyes were like deep wells. He had the posture of a creature that has watched a mountain and understood the ways hunger can wear a tooth into a ridge. He drew a single long tree on the chalkboard that night, etched it with deliberate strokes, and then circled our house beneath it as if making an offering. We slept badly. I woke with the image of the hunter's truck in my head like a bruise. The legal machinery moved forward in the weeks that followed. The trust took title in stages, slow, deliberate transfers that felt like loading a small and precious item into a safe. The land trust filed the easement, with language protecting the property's ecological values and prohibiting unauthorized visitors and scientific exploitation without consent from a small advisory committee. A confidentiality clause was written and agreed upon by everyone in our small circle. Aaron's samples were cataloged and placed, under court order, into sealed evidence boxes in the regional archive. The camcorder footage sat in a locked drive, encrypted and accessible only by legal petition.
There was a ceremony of sorts when the final seal was signed. We did not invite the press. We did not take photos. Instead, Mara brought a small wooden box, stained dark, and placed the legal documents inside with the kind of reverence one might show a reliquary. We put the box on my mantel and agreed on a single precise phrase that all of the advisory committee could use in future: confidential evidence of long-term occupancy. We were adults arranging a retirement for a secret. Cran watched the ceremony the way a neighbor watches a wedding that is not theirs.
He sat on the stair and held a small carved spoon between his hands like a talisman. After the papers were signed, after the lawyers had drunk their thermoses and left with the grave politeness of officers of a civic religion, we walked the property slowly. For a time, words were useless. Instead, a small stage of gestures carried what we could not yet say. Kren brought me a new carving that day, a tiny model of the house with the trees in a ring around it. He put it on the workbench and tapped it twice, then looked up at me as if asking for an oath. I gave it in the only way I knew how, with a promise and with my own name written on a small card that I tucked into a corner of the mantel where the sun sometimes warmed it. "I will be the neighbor," the card read, shorthand for years of watchfulness. The advisory committee arranged a stewardship plan that was careful and subtle. Dr. Mitchell insisted that the land receive low-impact monitoring, occasional visits to check the health of the forest and the house's maintenance, but no disclosure. The field biologist agreed to continue his non-invasive observations and to file his notes under sealed conditions. The land trust accepted a fund to pay for these obligations and to keep a small staff in place. We were not naive. Legal protections can be litigated, easements can be challenged, but the institutions behind the protection were robust enough that any attempt to expose Kren would require resources, a legal basis, and a determination that most media outlets do not possess. We had bought time and a layer of deterrence. Time, in the end, is a kind of preservation. There were small victories. The camera boys stopped appearing. The forum thread cooled when an influential moderator removed incendiary speculation under the trust's legal notice. The hunters who had come that night found other prey. The county sheriff did a half-hearted check-in once to make sure we were okay, and then filed the report as resolved. The pressure abated into a slow weathering, and for many months the house returned to the rhythm Kren and I had built. We developed routines that were like the slow sowing of a life. I would tend the porch and bring him a slice of dense bread. He would leave a carved bead threaded on sinew at the base of the stair. He had favorite things: a certain knot in the wood that liked to be rubbed, the soft stretch of a blanket on cold mornings, the scent of mint left near the kettle. Once, in a winter so cold the creek shivered like glass, he taught me how to make a stew the way he preferred it. Not a recipe in our sense, but a sequence of gestures. Add a stick of bark for aroma, a handful of root vegetables, a slow stirring that did not hurry the pot. He passed me the spoon and then, as if offering a sacrament, touched my knuckles with his thumb. His skin was rough but warm. We also wrestled with the philosophical shape of secrecy. There were nights when I would sit and ask myself whether keeping him hidden was a betrayal of science or a necessary kindness. Dr. Mitchell would always answer with a simple, steady fact: the world is not always kind to what it does not understand. If disclosure meant spectacle and harm, then protecting the life could be the truest scientific humility. If disclosure had a pathway to a protective, ethical framework that would preserve him, then perhaps it should be considered, but only if the probability of harm was lower than the probability of help. She talked like a person who weighed variables and cared for them like children. Her ethic was not romantic, it was pragmatic and rooted. Kren elaborated the stakes for me in a way that made the choice less abstract. One evening, a few months after the trust took title, he drew a succession of images that read like a short history. Trees with rings, a line of men with trucks, smoke, a river choked by logging, a small house with nothing around it. He then drew a small figure lying under a tree and a circle of stones around it like a memorial.
He was not asking to be venerated, he was asking to be remembered as something that lived among the trees. It was a plea that resembled a lecture. We talked, if one can call the silhouetted exchange of gestures, drawings, and small sounds talk. He drew the river in arcs and pointed to the bank and then at me, and then he drew people with backpacks and cameras. He placed his hand on my chest and tapped twice, slow, as if measuring my pulse and then measuring the land's. It felt like an inventory taken by someone who had been keeping record for decades. My own health began to whisper its presence more often. I turned 65 in that cabin, and age is a discreet thing that shows in the way you get up from chairs now and the way your fingers ache when you carve. I became acutely aware that a plan could not depend only on my watchfulness. The trust, the sealed records, the stewardship plan, these were not just legal scaffolding, they were a passing of responsibility from one mortal to structures that could, in theory, persist. I took comfort in that. Part of me wanted to make Kren's life independent of my presence, precisely to make his survival less vulnerable to a single man's mortality. There was a quiet maturation to our relationship. We shifted from the tentative choreography of strangers to something like companionship. I learned to recognize certain intonations in his low vocalizations, a curious trill when he found something new, a guttural note like a laugh when he saw pine cones stacked in a pattern he liked. He would come to the porch and sit in a pool of amber light while I read aloud, sometimes Yeats, sometimes Thoreau, because perhaps the cadence of human voice felt like a map to him. Once he took a small piece of my hair and tucked it into the corner of a carved bear, as if making a keepsake. It felt both absurd and sacred. Years passed in the half-light. The house continued to age. The eaves needed painting. The porch slats were replaced as they weathered. Kren took to these tasks like a seasoned carpenter, his movements careful and expert. He once repaired a loose chair with a kind of reverence I had seen only in makers. When he worked, he hummed low notes that seemed to stitch the wood back into being. There was one more moment that I had not anticipated, a breach that was not the fault of hunters or cameramen, but of a natural event. A late summer storm knocked a tree onto the roof of a neighboring parcel and displaced a small bridge on the county road. The road closure routed curious traffic toward other parts of the mountain. A reporter, less interested in fame than in a soft human interest story, stopped by with the hope of writing a piece on old houses and local color. He was polite and asked for permission. Mara had an arrangement with local reporters to decline interviews and to refer them to the land trust, an approach that kept the story from turning into a ravenous thing. This reporter, however, had a soft respect for the hyphenated edges of life. He asked me about solitude, about grief, about a man living in an old house. I told him, on principle, nothing about Kren. He left, and in a week his piece appeared, not as a hunt for cryptids, but as a meditation on aging and place. I remember thinking then that not all exposure is equal. Some stories disperse, like mist and water, the roots. Others strip bark a living thing. We had chosen the first. In time, Kren's message about us, his frightening warning rendered in chalk and carvings, settled into the marrow of how I thought about stewardship. It was not a prophecy so much as a ledger, a record of what happens when consumption outruns care. I think he understood that people like me could make legal protections, could set up trusts and easements, could hold records under seal. But his plea was deeper. It was a demand that the human species rethink the arithmetic of taking. He had seen rings of trees fall into stumps and had drawn them again and again until they lodged under my ribs. On a late autumn night, with frost in the hollows and the sky a dense lantern of stars, we sat on the porch and watched the light leave the pines. Kren set a small carving on the rail, a tiny tree with a ring of dots around it. He pointed to each dot, then to me, and then to the tree. He tapped my chest twice and then pointed to the road down the hill. He did not need language to tell me that the world beyond the pines was moving in ways that mattered. He had been drawing that accounting for decades. I have tried, in the years since, to tell this story without causing harm. I say story because that is what it is here, a personal testimony, a fiction framed as truth for the purposes of preserving what I know.
I cannot, in good conscience, present this as incontrovertible proof of anything beyond the fact that someone, something, lives in the margins where we often prefer not to look. I can present the artifacts, the carvings, the footage kept sealed, the trust documents that protect a parcel of forest. These are part of a narrative that is neither courtroom evidence nor sensational headline. They are a testament to a relationship between a man and a life that chose the edges of his house for shelter. There are days when I think of how easy it would be to tell the world everything. Fame would buy papers and lectures and a tidy kind of immortality. But fame would also fill the porch with shoes and cameras and men who do not see wood as an afterlife, but as a commodity. I think of Kren and the way he touches the kettle and teaches me the name of a knot in the pine like a blessing, and I choose service over provocation. This is not martyrdom. It is a simple, stubborn ethic that the vulnerable should not be offered up to curiosity. We have been careful, but we are not safe from time. I am not immortal, neither, perhaps, is he. But the trust, the easement, the sealed records, they are the implements of a long view. If I die tomorrow, there will be people bound by legal duty and human decency who will tend the property and guard the secret. They are ordinary people with good hearts and a taste for caution. They will do the slow, invisible work that keeps lives from being turned into spectacles. There is a final thing I want to say, and it is the frightening part of the message. It is not frightening because it involves monsters or a cosmic vengeance. It is frightening because it is so ordinary. We are very good at taking until there is nothing left to take. We treat the world like a ledger in which only the sums matter, and we forget that each entry is a life. Kren's chalk drawings, saws, smoke, people with devices were not threats. They were accounting. They were the way someone who had watched the forest peel away could show us, plainly, what we were doing. So I have taken responsibility in the small, legal ways that are available to me. I taught myself, with the guile of a man who once negotiated contracts in fluorescent rooms, to use law to make secrecy sustainable. I have surrounded the house with a modest institutional apparatus that says, "Do not come here without permission, and if you do, the law will find you." More importantly, I have embedded in that apparatus an ethical covenant. Anyone who learns of Kren's existence must treat it as a trust. That covenant is a moral instrument, not merely legalese. It is the promise that a life will not be given away for clicks. Sometimes people send me messages asking if what I tell is true. I answer, carefully, "This is my testimony. Believe it if you must, and if you do, let it teach you something vaguer and more urgent than belief itself, that living beings depend on our discretion." Do not turn curiosity into extraction. Let wonder be a reason for care rather than conquest. On clear nights, Kren and I sit with the porch light spilling like a lighthouse and watch the stars peel across the sky. He reaches out sometimes and touches my sleeve as if counting me among the living. He has a way of tilting his head that suggests he is listening for something beyond our world. But when he looks at me, there is a patience that is almost a benediction. We are, in our small way, neighbors, guardians of a mutual secret. If this story moved you, consider supporting local land trusts or conservation organizations that work to protect habitat and the species that depend on it. Small actions, donations, volunteering, learning, help preserve places for lives that cannot speak in our language. And if you found this narrative meaningful, subscribe to this channel for more true-feeling stories of place and the fragile lives that share it with us.
Above all, treat the wild with the humility it asks for. Sometimes the most important truths come not with a roar, but with a chalk line on a board.